The first thing taken from Adan was not her home. It was her name. When her mother died, the world did not end in storm or thunder. It ended in a quiet that wrapped around her like a burial cloth. The body was laid out in the courtyard with a calabash of water beside it, a mirror turned face down on the mat, and Adan wasn't allowed to touch her. The stepmother, Nkaruka, said, "The living must not reach back for the dead." But Adan didn't want to pull her mother back, only hold her hand once more. She was 12. That same night, Nkaruka moved her into the hut with the goats. At first, Adan thought it was a punishment for crying too loudly during the morning, or for asking if she could keep her mother's comb. But no one told her why. They simply pulled her from the woven mat she had always slept on and pointed to the half-moon hut behind the compound, where the air was thick with animal breath and the floor was pressed down hay and goat droppings. Her step-brothers, Kalechi and Obiora, stood at the door and laughed. "Beasts sleep with beasts," Kalechi said. From that night forward, she was no longer called Adan. Not once. Beast. Goat girl. Ragchild. These were the names that filled her ears like stones. The villagers did not interfere. Most of them looked away when they saw her running barefoot across the compound with torn cloth and bruises half hidden beneath grime. Nkaruka had a silver tongue and the kind of beauty that made people hesitate before questioning her. She told the women at the stream that Adan was wild. Said she howled in her sleep, that she fought her stepbrothers, that she cursed under her breath. None of it was true. But in the mouths of the beautiful, lies always sound sweeter. Her real name was only spoken once a year, on her mother's death day, when Adan sat beside the unmarked grave and whispered it to the soil like a secret. I am still Adan. I have not forgotten. But the world refused to remember. Her rags were stitched together from scraps of old goat hides, the rough kind used to carry firewood. The smell clung to her no matter how many times she tried to wash herself in the river. The girls at the stream pinched their noses when she approached, and the boys threw pebbles at her back when she walked by with a clay pot wobbling on her head. She did not answer them. The first time she was beaten for answering back, she had said, "I am not a beast." Kalechi had pushed her into the goat trough and poured water over her face until she choked. Obiora laughed and told her to speak like a girl, not a goat. That night she did not cry. She lay on the dirt, wrapped in her goat hide, and pressed her lips together so tightly they left a red line across her face. But silence did not protect her. It only made her more invisible. Nkaruka's favorite punishment was denying her food. If Adan made a mistake while sweeping or feeding the goats, her stepmother would say, "No meal for the beast today." The boys would eat in front of her, licking their fingers and throwing bones at her feet. The only food she got was what she stole from the edge of the pot when no one was looking. Once, she ate a yam that hadn't cooked through, hard as stone, and was sick for 2 days in the corner of the goat pen. No one noticed. Except the oldest goat, a white one with a crooked horn and a scar across its left leg. It stayed near her when she vomited and licked her hand afterward. She called him Udo, which meant peace, though no peace lived in the compound. Sometimes she whispered stories to him. Stories her mother used to tell by firelight. Stories about spirits who wore other people's faces, and girls who learned to speak the language of wind. She missed her mother's voice more than she missed food. One evening, while the rest of the compound gathered to listen to a traveling drummer, Adan stayed behind with the animals. She sat with Udo curled beside her, and for the first time in many days she sang. It was soft and low, a lullaby her mother used to hum while combing her hair. Her voice cracked in the middle, but she finished the song. She didn't notice that someone was watching her. Obiora, the younger stepbrother, had doubled back to retrieve something. He stood at the edge of the goat pen, hidden by the night, and heard the song. The next morning he mocked her. "The beast sings for goats," he said to the other children. "Maybe next she'll marry one." The laughter cut like stones. But Adan didn't respond. She simply walked past them, skin hot with shame, and disappeared behind the hut. That day Udo went missing. They said the old goat had wandered too far into the hills. But when Adan found tufts of his white fur near the cooking stones and the pot that night tasted strangely sweet, she didn't ask questions. She vomited again that night. But not from the food. From grief. There was no morning song for Udo. No grave. No memory. Just silence. And in that silence, something inside her changed. She stopped speaking altogether. Not a word to anyone, not even at her mother's grave. But she began to watch more closely. She watched how Nkaruka's hands trembled slightly after returning from the shrine. She saw how Kalechi flinched when thunder cracked in the sky, though he pretended to be brave. She noticed how Obiora chewed the inside of his cheek when he lied. She saw everything. She waited. No one noticed how sharp her eyes had become. How tall she was growing beneath the goat skins. How still she could be when listening. The girl they called Beast was learning. Not just to survive, but to remember. Because even a name buried under cruelty still echoes in the bones. And somewhere deep inside her chest, Adan still whispered to herself in the voice of her mother. Asterisk, they may not call you by name, my daughter, but it is still yours. And one day they will remember. Asterisk. That night, as the wind shook the palm leaves outside the hut and the goats shuffled in their sleep, she lay awake under her ragged cloth, wide-eyed. Not broken. Not quiet. Just waiting. The night the voice came, the sky was heavy with a kind of darkness that felt older than clouds. No stars. No moon. Just a thick stretch of black, as if the heavens had swallowed their own light in mourning. Adan had not eaten that day. Nkaruka had slapped her for tearing a seam in the goat hide tunic. Kalechi had spit in her water. Obiora had poured millet chaff into her sleeping space. Even the goats, restless and agitated from the rising heat, butted at her legs and kicked dust in her eyes. By the time night came she felt hollow, not just in the belly but in the bones. Like something important had drained out of her, and all that remained was weight. Grief heavy as stones. She sat at the far end of the barn, pressed against the cracked clay wall where the thatch roof leaked slowly. Her knees were drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around them like they were the last thing she could hold. She wept without sound. She was good at that now. Crying without letting the breath tremble too loudly. Without drawing attention. The goats knew her sorrow but they didn't speak of it. She was glad for that. The dirt beneath her was cool and damp. Her tears made small, dark circles that soaked in quickly. The kind of crying that didn't need wailing. The kind that came from deep inside where no one had touched her in years. Not with kindness. Not even with carelessness. And then she heard it. Not the bleating of goats. Not the rustle of hay or the snap of insects in the rafters. A growl. Oh, soft. Barely louder than the rasp of her own breath. She froze. It was not one of the goats. They made other sounds. Softer. Clumsier. This was smooth. Controlled. The kind of growl that knew how to wait. Her eyes strained against the dark. There, near the beam that held up the rear corner of the barn. Two eyes. Glowing faintly. Ember gold. They blinked once. Not fast. Not startled. Slowly. Deliberately. She pressed herself harder into the wall, heart pounding so loud it felt like it echoed in the space. But her body didn't scream. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't even breathe too loud. Because something in her, something deeper than fear, recognized that look. Those eyes did not belong to a beast looking for prey. They belonged to something that had also been made to crouch in darkness. Something else they had cast aside. The growl stopped. And in the silence that followed, she felt it. Warmth. Breath. Near her left ear. But nothing had moved. The eyes were still across the barn. Yet something unseen was near enough to feel. Then came the voice. Soft. Ancient. More exhale than whisper. You are not the only one they cast in skin. Her breath caught. She didn't move. The warmth remained by her ear for a moment longer, then faded like steam slipping off a calabash. She turned toward the source. Nothing. Only shadows. When she turned back to the corner where the eyes had been, they were gone. No sound of footsteps. No shifting of hay. No clatter of hooves or claws or paws. Gone like a dream you remember too late. Adan remained still for what felt like a full hour. Then slowly she uncurled her legs. Her skin prickled, not from cold but from knowing. That kind of knowing that doesn't come from learning but from recognition. Her heart still beat hard but not with terror. With alertness. That voice had not come to threaten. It had come to remind. All her life she had believed herself alone, the only one cast down, stripped of a name, forced to wear the wrong skin. But tonight the dark itself had whispered, "You are not the only one." She leaned forward and touched the dirt where her tears had fallen. There, where her fingers met the earth, something was buried. She brushed gently, then scooped it free. A tooth. Not a goat's. Too long. Too sharp. The color of old ivory. Curved at the tip like it had belonged to something that hunted under moonlight. She held it in her hand. It was warm. She didn't know why, but it felt like a gift. Or a promise. Or maybe both. The next morning the others noticed a change. They just didn't know what it was. Adan still wore her goat hide rags. She still hauled water, cleaned the troughs, chased the younger goats with gentle hands. But something in her walk had shifted. It wasn't confidence. Not the loud kind, not the kind Obiora used when puffing his chest. It was quieter. Firmer. Like her feet had stopped asking permission from the ground. Like she knew she belonged. She tucked the tooth beneath the leather strap that held her tunic closed. Each time she touched it, a pulse of heat met her fingers. Gentle. Steady. She began to listen more deeply to the dark. She found corners in the barn where the hay never molded, even in the rain. She heard low hums in the beams when the wind passed through. And some nights, when the stars refused to shine, she saw those eyes again. Always watching. Never threatening. Just present. One night, Obiora crept into the barn with a stolen torch, planning to frighten her while she slept. He lit the edge of the straw and called her name, not her real name of course, but the word he had always used, beast. Before she could move, the shadows shifted. The flame in his torch blew sideways, then out. He screamed. The next morning he told Kalechi he had seen something. Something crouched behind Adan, taller than a man, teeth like stone knives, eyes glowing like embers. Kalechi laughed. But Obiora never returned to the barn after sunset. Adan never spoke of it. She didn't need to. She had begun to understand something important. The skin they forced on her was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. And now she was not alone in the shadows. Something else waited with her. Teeth bared. Voice steady. Watching. And one day, soon, the dark would speak again. The first wound came like all the others, sudden, cruel, and unprovoked. It was late afternoon, and the sun had dulled behind a wall of gray clouds. A restless heat clung to the air, heavy with the scent of drying goat dung and Karuka's simmering stew. Adan was crouched beside the goat pen, scrubbing at the trough with a worn palm frond, her ragged cloak hanging loose at her shoulders, still damp from river water. Obiora stood near the kitchen fire, bored and irritable. He had taken to throwing stones again, first at the goats, then at her feet. When she didn't react, he moved closer, carrying his anger like a drumbeat behind his teeth. "Are your ears stuffed with goat wool, beast?" he hissed. "Or is your brain as empty as that trough?" She said nothing. She had long learned silence was safer than defiance. But silence didn't always save her. Obiora stepped forward and grabbed her shoulder. When she pulled away, not roughly, only with that slow weariness she always carried, he struck her. The back of his hand cracked across her cheek, forcing her to the ground. She tasted copper. But then just as fast he cried out. "Ah! Something bit me." He looked at his hand, and there, across the back of it, were 3 deep scratches. Thin, precise, and bleeding freely. They were too fine for fingernails. Too sharp for anything blunt. Adan blinked in confusion. She hadn't hit him. She hadn't raised a hand. But when she looked down, she saw something strange in the torn edge of her cloak. A sliver of something, curved, hard, pale like old bone, almost like a claw. She blinked again. It was gone. Obiora backed away, eyes wide, cradling his bleeding hand. You witch." He spat on the ground near her feet and ran inside. Kalechi met him at the doorway, demanding to know what happened, but Obiora said nothing else. That night, the household buzzed with murmurs. Adan was left to the barn again as always, but she did not sleep. She lay on her side, knees curled to her chest, hands pressed flat against the dirt floor. And she felt wrong. Or maybe too right. Like something beneath her skin had shifted in response to the strike. Not from pain but from something deeper, a calling. Like a whisper had been pulled forward from her bones, reminding her that blood wasn't the only thing that could rise when hurt. The next morning, Obiora's hand was swollen and purple. By noon, a dark green ring formed around the wound. He was taken to the herbalist's hut, and the woman clucked her tongue. "This is not infection," she said slowly. "It is rejection. His body is spitting something out, or refusing to let something in." Kalechi mocked him. Afraid of a girl's nails? But when Obiora tried to defend himself, he fainted mid-sentence. Adan said nothing. But that night she did not sleep again. She dreamt of fur brushing her cheeks, of her own fingers digging into damp soil, of running, not walking, but running on all fours, fast and low beneath tree roots in moonlight. She woke at dawn with dirt packed under her fingernails, and a tuft of coarse, dark hair clutched in her palm. She stared at it. The strands were too long to be goat. And the color? It was the same black-brown as the thing she sometimes saw blinking in the shadows. She tucked it into the seam of her tunic, beside the tooth. 3 nights passed. Obiora worsened. His skin turned hot and pale. He mumbled in his sleep, eyes twitching beneath closed lids, whispering things no one understood. He cried out once for his mother, and Karuka did not answer. She was afraid. Not of sickness, but of Adan. She did not say it aloud, but her movements changed. She no longer struck the girl without reason. She avoided eye contact. She told the boys to keep away from her, to let her tend the goats and nothing else. The fear gave Adan space. And in that space she noticed the changes growing louder. Her nails, which had always been short and split from labor, now grew faster and thicker. Not soft and pink, but darkening at the edges like hardened tips. Some mornings her feet ached like she'd walked miles. Her muscles twitched as if remembering movements she hadn't made. One morning she woke with a new scar running along her forearm. It wasn't a wound. It was a pattern. Pale against her skin. Like bark. Like a marking. She stared at it for an hour. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she began paying closer attention to the land around the barn. She watched how the goats responded to her, how they no longer nudged or kicked, how they lowered their heads when she approached. And at night, the shadows shifted closer than before. The eyes returned. One night, when the wind blew strong and the trees cracked against one another in the distance, she stood at the doorway of the barn and whispered into the dark. "Who am I becoming?" The silence that answered was not empty. It was listening. The next day she found another claw. Not in her cloak. In her bedroll. Curved. Pale. Still warm. It was longer than the first. Sharper. She did not flinch this time. She held it like a key. Obiora's wound began to heal, but wrong. The flesh closed unevenly, leaving a twisted scar like a snake frozen mid-coil. His hand trembled constantly. He refused to speak of the moment that started it, but he would no longer pass within 5 paces of Adan. Even Kalechi kept his distance now. And Karuka watched her when she thought the girl wasn't looking. Her hands always twitching toward her prayer beads, her lips always slightly moving. Adan began walking taller. Her limbs no longer ached from labor the way they used to. Her eyes adjusted faster in the dark. Her hearing sharpened. She could hear the footsteps of mice across the grain bins, the breath of goats before they sneezed, the rustle of feathers high in the tree before dawn. One morning she caught a rat with her bare hands. She didn't kill it. She held it, watched it, then let it go. Because she didn't hunger for it. She wasn't becoming an animal. She was becoming other. Something in between. Something old. The tooth. The claw. The marking. All of it whispered to her now. Not in words. In memory. In sensation. In instincts that felt like inherited dreams. And the shadows around the barn, they no longer blinked and vanished. Now they watched. And waited. Just as she did. For what she didn't yet know. But she could feel it coming. Something had been clawed loose the day Obiora struck her. And now it was awake. The first howl came on a night when the clouds parted just enough to let the moon spill through, silver and sharp like a blade across the sky. It was long and low, distant but clear, threading through the trees like a story returning to a place it once knew. Adan was awake when she heard it. She always was now. She sat in the barn, back against the old central post, a goat curled near her feet, another resting its chin on her knee. They no longer feared her. They no longer regarded her as separate. Even the smallest one, the jittery kid with mismatched hooves, followed her with strange calmness. The howl rose again. Closer this time. Not a threat. Not a warning. Just a call. And something in Adan responded. Not in words. In hums. Her throat, without instruction, began to vibrate with a sound she did not recognize but somehow remembered. A low melody, ancient and smooth, rising and falling with the rhythm of the wind and the ache in her ribs. She did not even realize she was humming at first. But when she did, she stopped breathing. The song, it was not hers. It belonged to her mother. A memory flashed, blurred by time. Her mother, sitting by the hearth, braiding Adan's hair with gentle fingers, whispering a tune beneath her breath. A strange, wild thing. Not like the songs the village girls sang. Not like the chants of the priestesses. It had rhythm but no pattern. It had meaning but no words. Adan had asked once, "What are you singing, Mama?" And her mother had only smiled. A song for those who walk alone and find others waiting. Adan hadn't understood it then. She did now. She hummed louder. The goats lifted their heads, ears twitching. Then, one by one, they stood and circled her, forming a silent ring around where she sat. Not restless. Not afraid. Still. Listening. The next morning they followed her without need for prodding. No tethers. No slaps. When she rose to gather water, they lined up behind her like guards. When she stepped into the field to fetch scattered feed, they shadowed her closely. Even the elder buck, the one who had once butted her in the ribs for stepping too near, now nudged aside thorns in her path. It did not go unnoticed. Obiora said nothing, but he stared too long whenever she passed. Kalechi muttered something once, something about beasts obeying beasts, but his voice was quiet, and he quickly turned away when she looked at him. It was Nkaruka who reacted most strongly. She began sleeping with her doors latched. She sprinkled salt at the threshold. She avoided looking Adan in the eye, but watched her constantly from behind shuttered windows, fingers curling and uncurling as if she wanted to throw something but had forgotten how to aim. By the third day the howling in the forest came every night. Not just once, but again and again, a layered chorus of voices weaving through the trees like a net of sound. Deep-throated howls and short, sharp barks, sometimes melodic, sometimes mournful. Adan began humming without effort now. Sometimes it came to her while she worked. Sometimes while she stood still and breathed in the wind. She would hum while gathering firewood, and the goats would cluster tightly behind her. She would hum in the river while rinsing the troughs, and the water itself seemed to quiet. She did not feel powerful. She felt, right, like a puzzle had finally turned its last piece and clicked into place. But power is not always felt by the one who holds it, only by those who fear it. One evening, just as the sun vanished behind the hills, Nkaruka rushed into the village square, eyes wide, wrapper slipping from one shoulder. "The barn," she cried. It growled. The villagers looked up from their simmering pots and story circles. "What did you say?" asked the oldest weaver. "The barn," Nkaruka hissed, her voice shaking. "I heard it. I heard the ground inside groan like a wounded lion. It happened when the girl was weeping." Whispers spread like fire in dry grass. Some looked toward the barn with uneasy faces. Others shook their heads. "She's only a child," they said. But a few remembered the strange story of Obiora's wound. The tooth she wore around her neck. The way the goats obeyed her without reason. And the howls. Always the howls. Adan did not answer the gossip. That night, as the sun fell and the shadows stretched, she sat at the edge of the barn, her legs drawn up, arms around her knees, watching the dark press against the trees. She wasn't crying, not anymore. But something inside her was stretching, rising, remembering. And when the first howl came, she opened her mouth and answered. Her voice wasn't strong. It wasn't wild or furious. It was soft, a single note that rose like smoke, wavered and settled on the wind. And from the woods the howling stopped, replaced by silence. Then footsteps. Not loud. Not heavy. Soft pads across the ground. Leaves shifting. Branches parting. She stood and stepped forward, not afraid. Her bare feet touched the edge of the grass. And there, between two trees, a shape stood. It was not a wolf. Not a man. Something in between. Its eyes were golden. Its fur a patchwork of shadows. Its form flickered at the edges, like a candle behind cloth. It did not snarl. It bowed its head. And Adan, slowly, gently, bowed hers in return. Neither spoke. But something passed between them. Recognition. Belonging. The creature turned and vanished back into the woods. She returned to the barn without a word, the goats following behind like they always did. That night, Nkaruka did not sleep. She claimed the wind carried voices. She said something breathed beneath the floorboards. She woke screaming once, clutching her neck, convinced she heard Adan's song in her ear. The villagers began leaving offerings outside the barn. Just small ones, dried meat, kola nut, a gourd of palm oil. No one said why. But they had seen the girl walk alone through the forest paths that others feared. And they had seen the way animals moved around her. And they had heard on certain nights, when the wind shifted and the trees leaned close, a low, wild melody that no child should know, but somehow she did. The song of the pack. The song that waited for no permission, that remembered every exile, and always returned to those whose names had been buried. Adan did not sing to be feared. She sang because she remembered. Because someone had once hummed the same tune into her braids and told her, one day, your voice will be all the others need to find you. And they were finding her now. The day of the feast came with gold in the sky and dust in the air. It was a celebration for the harvest. The yams had been thick and sweet, the millet golden, the rains kinder than expected. Villagers bustled through the compound with baskets and drums, laughter bubbling in the heat. Smoke curled from roasting pits. The scent of pepper, roasted palm fruit, and fresh oil filled the wind. Adan was not invited to the table. Of course not. She watched from the edge of the barn, back against the clay wall, as children chased each other past her, skirts flaring, cheeks sticky with boiled sugar cane. She had spent all morning hauling water and pounding roots, only to be sent away before the food was served. Nkaruka made a show of walking past her with steaming trays, eyes never meeting Adan's. "Beasts eat later," she said loudly enough for others to hear. Adan said nothing. Her fingers, stained with cassava paste and dried leaf, clenched in her lap. Her goat-hide rags, worn, frayed, damp from sweat, clung to her skin. She had grown used to the itch, the stink, the scratch of the seams. But today it burned. Like the skin beneath the skin had begun to chafe, trying to come through. She thought of the tooth still tucked under the string around her neck. Of the claw hidden in her bedroll. Of the song she'd hummed last night that made the dogs in the next compound howl in unison. And she thought of the dream she'd had 2 nights ago, of running, fast and low, jaws open, wind cold on her tongue. She had woken with dirt in her teeth. The music from the courtyard grew louder. Someone struck a talking drum. Someone else began to chant. Then came Obiora's voice, thick with drink and full of the kind of swagger only cruelty makes permanent. "Where's the goat girl?" he shouted. "The beast with ears like bark?" Laughter followed. Adan looked down, willing herself to stay still. But it didn't matter. A shadow fell across her. "You're not deaf, are you, Adan?" Obiora said, his words slurred, his face flushed. "Come, dance for us. You can't sing, but maybe the goats taught you how to wag your tail." His hand reached for her. She tried to pull away, but he was faster this time, stronger. He yanked her up by the arm and dragged her into the center of the courtyard. People turned. Some laughed. Some looked away. Others leaned in with curious smiles as if they were about to watch a spectacle. She stood there, barefoot and tense, while Obiora spun around her like a mock dancer, bleeding like a goat. Kalechi clapped along. Even the priestess's son, the one who used to give her kind glances when they were younger, chuckled and did nothing. "She doesn't need a wrapper," Obiora sneered. "She's already dressed for the barn." He reached forward and grabbed the edge of her cloak. It tore with a loud rip. The sound echoed too loud in her ears, louder than the drums, louder than the fire crackling nearby. The goat hide sloughed down her shoulder, bearing a thin stretch of skin and an old scar that looked, under the firelight, like a fading glyph. "See," he shouted, raising the rag like a trophy. "Even her skin's marked like an animal." Adan didn't scream. She didn't cry. She only stared at him, at his laughing mouth, his crooked teeth, his flushed cheeks. Something moved behind her ribs. Not a breath. Not a heartbeat. A twitch. A curl. A snap. Her lips peeled back. Her teeth, just for a moment, shifted. They lengthened. Sharpened. Her vision narrowed until only his face remained. And then she lunged. Not far. Just a step forward, just enough to sink her teeth into the soft meat of his shoulder, right where his tunic dipped. She bit down, not like a child. Not even like a girl. Like something else. Like a thing that had been caged too long and had finally remembered what freedom tasted like. Obiora screamed. Not from pain. From something deeper. Terror. She pulled back, lips slick with spit, her breath hard and hot. The music had stopped. Silence spread like oil in a pan. Everyone stared. Obiora staggered back, hand to his shoulder. There was no blood. Only a small mark. Half-moon indentations. No tear. No broken skin. Just a mark. "Which," he whispered, voice trembling. You bit me?" She said nothing. Could say nothing. Her jaw ached. Her teeth, as she ran her tongue over them, had returned to normal. Blunt. Human. But her body still hummed like a drum. Her skin prickled. Her knees wanted to bend and leap. She turned and walked away. No one stopped her. No one followed. That night the drums did not play. And the next morning Obiora awoke screaming. He tore at his tunic, ripping it from his shoulder. The flesh where she had bitten him was red, not bleeding but raw. As if the skin itself had been burned from the inside. No salve soothed it. No herb cooled it. He drank bitter root until he vomited. Still it throbbed. Still it burned. By the third night he could no longer sleep. The pain was not steady, it pulsed. Like it was alive. And his dreams, they had changed. He saw her. Down. Standing in the trees, wrapped in black fur and ash. Eyes glowing. Voice low. Singing a song without melody. And behind her, a pack. Shadows with teeth. Shapes with claws. All watching him. Obiora stopped speaking altogether after that. He refused to leave his mat. He scratched at his shoulder until it bled. And even then the mark remained. The village grew quiet. No one asked about the feast. No one mocked the girl in goat skins anymore. When Adan passed, people moved aside. Not out of kindness. Out of something older. Recognition maybe. She still wore rags. But now she walked like they were robes. The goats still followed her. But now so did the shadows. And at night she no longer just hummed. She howled. Not loud. Not wild. Just enough. Enough for the forest to answer. It was just after dusk when the old woman came. The village had curled into its nightly hush, fires dimmed, doors drawn, only the occasional murmur of someone stirring coals or stifling a child's cough. But outside the barn the wind shifted and Adan, sitting with her back to the post, smelled something different. Not danger. Not smoke. Or stone. Something ancient. She stood and stepped to the barn door, peering out. The goats stirred but didn't bleat. There, at the edge of the clearing, hunched and draped in a wrapper faded with time, stood an old woman, one Adan did not recognize. Her skin was dark and dry as tree bark, eyes bright with a knowing glow. She moved with difficulty but purpose, leaning heavily on a carved stick that looked older than the village itself. In her other hand she held something wrapped in cloth. Adan did not speak. The old woman nodded as if she'd expected that. She shuffled closer, each step deliberate. When she stood just a few paces from Adan, she reached forward and placed the cloth-wrapped bundle gently on the ground. Then she bent, impossibly low for someone her age, until her lips were near the dirt. She of the rags, the woman whispered, her voice like wind in dry grass. She of the bones that do not break. She of the song remembered. She straightened slowly and looked directly into Adan's eyes. Rise. That was all. No name. No farewell. She turned and vanished into the trees before Adan could ask who she was, or how she knew. Adan stared at the bundle for a long time. Then carefully she crouched and unwrapped it. Inside was a small stone, warm to the touch, carved with the face of an animal she couldn't quite name. It had the snout of a wolf, the brow of a lion, the spiral horns of a ram. Its eyes were wide as if mid-howl. The edges of the stone were etched with old symbols, markings she didn't know but somehow understood. She held it to her chest. And the stone pulsed once. That night sleep came fast. But it wasn't deep. It was vast. She found herself standing in a clearing, grass high around her knees, sky thick with stars. The trees loomed taller than mountains and the air shimmered with silence. Then, it stepped forward. The beast. Massive. Towering. Its body was patchworked with stitched furs, lion mane, hyena hide, black goat curls, silver wolf strands. Its face was neither man nor creature and both. Antlers stretched above its head like roots reaching upward. Its eyes glowed amber and sorrowful. It said nothing. It didn't need to. It raised one enormous paw, patted and clawed, wrapped in dark silk strands, and pressed it gently over her heart. Not to crush. To mark. To bless. Adan's chest burned, not in pain but in memory. Every strike she'd endured. Every name stripped from her. Every moment she'd bitten down the howl in her throat. They surged through her now, not as wounds but as fuel. The beast leaned closer. And in a voice older than thunder it said, "You are not what they named you. You are what we remember." Then it was gone. And she awoke, breath shallow, eyes wet. The goats slept soundly. The barn was still. But when she placed her hand over her chest, where the paw had rested, she felt it, the thrum of something awake inside her. The stone lay beside her mat. And now the carved beast's eyes were closed, as if it had finished watching. At first it was small things. A clay pot of water tipped over without explanation. Roasted yams meant for breakfast went missing. The door to the granary stood ajar in the morning, though it had been locked with twine and charmed the night before. Karuka blamed rats. Then spirits. Then Adan. Her silence hides fangs, she muttered to her sons as they ate their meals, chewing quickly, eyes flicking toward the barn. Adan never responded. She sat at the far end of the yard with the goats, head lowered, fingers tracing the stone with the carved beast face. She hardly spoke at all anymore, not from fear but from something deeper, as if her voice was no longer meant for them. But the strangeness grew louder. Every night, the house shook with strange sounds, not from wind or thunder but from clawing. Low scratching at the wooden beams. Shuffling just beyond the thatch roof. Once, a scream that seemed to echo from beneath the floorboards. Obiora woke one night with slashes across his woven mat, 5 deep claw marks cutting straight through the fiber. Kalechi found all his wrappers torn into thin ribbons, as if chewed by teeth that knew where to bite. Nkaruka placed protective charms at every doorway. She poured salt around the family bed. She lit incense and muttered prayers to gods she barely believed in. But nothing worked. Each night the fear returned. Sleep became a stranger to the household. The brothers took turns keeping watch, but each fell into strange half-dreams where they swore they heard growling from inside their own chests. They began speaking less, flinching more. Nkaruka's eyes grew sunken. Her voice, once sharp as thorn, cracked when she raised it. The villagers noticed. They began avoiding the compound at dusk. Someone whispered that a shadow lingered near the barn, a shape that breathed but was not seen, that watched from the trees, waiting. Maybe the girl calls it, they said. Maybe she is it. One night, long past midnight, Nkaruka awoke with a jolt. There was no sound, but something had changed in the air. It was too still. Too thick. She sat up, breath shallow, reaching for her wrapper. And froze. Outside the open barn, under the sliver of moonlight filtering through the thatch gaps, the goats were moving. No, not moving. Positioning. One by one, slowly they knelt. Not in sleep. Not in rest. In reverence. Each goat knelt on bent legs, heads lowered toward the far corner where Adan's mat lay. Nkaruka's heart slammed against her ribs. She squinted. Adan lay on her side, unmoving. But her hand was extended, palm up, as if she had been receiving something in her sleep. The goats didn't move. They remained like statues, breathing slow and deep. Nkaruka backed away from the window. Her legs trembled. She tried to call for her sons, but her voice caught in her throat. That night, no one in the house slept. And by morning, Nkaruka's hair had begun to gray at the roots. The moon festival came with noise and color. Drums pulsing like heartbeats, dancers in raffia skirts and painted faces spinning through the dust, children lighting small oil lamps and placing them on the river to drift with prayers. The village shimmered with joy, with fire, with the hope that the moon would rise clear and round, blessing the next season with calm rains and fertile soil. But Adan was told to stay inside. Nkaruka had locked the barn door from the outside, muttering a charm and tying a strip of bark soaked in palm ash around the handle. "This is not a night for beasts," she hissed. "This is a night for the clean." Adan said nothing. She hadn't spoken aloud in weeks. Not because she had lost her voice, she hadn't. It sat beneath her tongue like a sleeping ember, too powerful to waste on those who refused to hear. Her silence had grown heavier. Not passive. Not fearful. The goats pressed close to her that night, their bodies strangely still as the wind shifted and the festival sounds echoed from the distance. From a small gap in the barn wall, she watched the celebration unfold. Firelight flickered high, shadows dancing along the clay huts. She could hear singing, laughter, flutes. She saw children run by with masks shaped like birds and fish. Someone lit a fire wheel and it spiraled into the sky, bursting in a red hiss. The world felt far away. Until the wind changed. Suddenly it was in her mouth, the scent of the fire. The spice of dust, the sweetness of fruit stew, the unmistakable taste of something sacred burning. And something inside her stirred. The goats all turned toward her at once. Then, slowly, without command, they knelt. She stood. The barn door was still shut, the charm still tied, but when she touched it, the bark slipped away like water through fingers. The wood creaked once and then opened, not loudly, not with drama. Just opened. And she walked out. Not hunched. Not creeping. She walked upright, bare feet steady on the packed earth, rags hanging from her shoulders like royal garb. Her hands did not shake. Her head did not lower. Her eyes glowed faintly amber in the moonlight. The festival crowd did not notice at first. She passed the edge of the gathering slowly, slipping between people as they danced and shouted and cheered. It wasn't until she reached the center, where the largest fire blazed and elders sat in a circle telling stories of ancestors and stars, that someone gasped. A girl in rags had entered the fire circle. Uninvited. Unclean. Unspoken for. Whispers rippled like a dropped stone in a pond. "Is that Nkaruka's girl? She's not meant to be here. She's cursed, the one who lives with goats." But she didn't stop walking. She stepped right into the ring of firelight, where the flames licked high into the air behind her, casting long shadows against the ochre walls. Laughter broke out. A few of the younger boys pointed. Someone shouted, "Did the barn vomit its child?" And others cackled in response. A woman clapped her hands mockingly. "Dance for us, beast girl." Adan said nothing. She just stood there, the fire at her back. Then the wind shifted again. And the flames rose. Not in chaos, in shape. The fire behind her, instead of scattering, curled inward, rising in two long arcs that stretched over her shoulders, high into the night. Flames like wings. Not bird wings. Not even angel wings. Something older. Something that remembered fur and fong and sky. And in that moment the crowd fell silent. Because her shadow, cast wide across the ground, did not match her shape. It was too tall. Its limbs too long. Its head too broad. It stood with her but beyond her, echoing her stance, but wrong. No one spoke. Children clung to their mothers. Elders reached quietly for protective beads. Even Karuka, who had been sitting at the edge with a bitter gourd in her lap, dropped it. Her mouth moved but no sound came out. Adan finally looked up, and her eyes, gold now, clear and steady, met theirs. She raised a single hand, palm out, and the fire obeyed. It parted behind her, lifting like a curtain, curling away from her skin as if afraid to burn her. She stepped forward, once, then twice, and as she did, the ground beneath her seemed to tremble. Not from weight, from memory. Because this was not the first time something like her had walked this land. And it would not be the last. She passed through the fire circle, never breaking eye contact, never hurrying. Her steps were deliberate, soundless. Where she walked, the drums faltered. By the time she reached the far edge of the gathering, no one moved. No one dared. She turned once, just for a heartbeat, and in her shadow the great beast flickered again. Not in mockery. Not in threat. In warning. In presence. Then she vanished into the night, the fire settling behind her, shrinking like it, too, knew it had gone too close to something sacred. And that night no one danced again. The forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No insects. Not even the wind dared speak. The trees, ancient and twisted, seemed to lean closer to one another, as though whispering secrets too old and dangerous to be heard aloud. The soil was damp underfoot, the air thick with the scent of moss and memory. Adan stood at the edge of the village, just where the path turned from packed earth to shadowed undergrowth. Her feet were bare, her hair unbound, and her eyes, once dull and downcast, now shone with a light that was not light. A weightless golden fire shimmered faintly beneath her skin. The stone with the carved beast's face lay tucked at her hip, humming softly like a heartbeat. Behind her, the village stirred uneasily. No one had seen her since the night of the moon festival, when she had walked through fire with flame-born wings and a shadow that didn't belong to any human child. Since that night, whispers had taken root like weeds. Crops failed. Chickens lay dead in the coop. Children spoke of dreams where they ran through woods not as themselves, but as something furred and sharp. They said the girl had become the thing the goats always knew she was. A beast. A storm in rags. A curse with eyes. And Karuka had tried to act unbothered, but sleep had fled her. Her hands trembled. Her bones ached. She poured salt on every doorstep and hung dry leaves over the bed, but still, the dreams came. The scratching on the walls returned. And then tonight, the night of the blood moon, she heard Adan's voice. For the first time. It was not the voice of a girl. It was the voice of the forest. It rose up from the ground, curled through the trees, and slid through every crack in every hut, filling ears and bowls and mouths, choking out sleep and silence. It was not a scream. It was a declaration. I name what was done. Her voice echoed not just through air, but through root and stone, through every animal that had ever watched her suffer, through every breath ever held in the throat of a girl afraid to speak. I name the first night I was left cold. A wind howled through the village. Doors burst open. Firewood cracked. I named the slap that broke my tooth. Ash rained from a hearth that hadn't been lit in hours. I named the nights I was starved while others feasted. Goats rose to their feet without command, stepping into the courtyard like soldiers. I name every insult that tried to become my name. The earth trembled beneath her. Villagers poured into the open, shouting, confused, clinging to charms. Then came a scream. Karuka, eyes wild, bolted from her hut, bare feet slapping the ground, trying to flee down the slope toward the yam fields. But the path twisted. The trees bent. The world around her shifted. She stumbled into the wrong clearing, one that hadn't been there before, and fell. Flat. Face first into the dirt. When she looked up, she gasped. She was surrounded. Not by people. By beasts. Their eyes glowed in the dark. Wolves, jackals, wild dogs, goats with horns too long, boars with bleeding tusks. They stood still, utterly silent, not moving to attack, not blinking. Watching her. And then she saw them clearly. Not beasts. Memories. The goat she'd starved because it was too slow. The dog she'd beaten with a stick until its leg broke. The hen she'd cursed for pecking her hand. All of them. Not dead. Not alive. Just present. Like the truth finally made flesh. She tried to scream, but the air in her throat turned solid. Her voice betrayed her. Adan stepped into the circle of beasts. She didn't walk, she moved like a whisper across bark, like smoke with feet. Her eyes held Nkaruka in place. And then, calmly, she crouched and touched the ground with her fingertips. The earth moaned. It wasn't loud, but it was deep. A sound that came from far beneath the roots, from the belly of the world. The trees creaked as if bracing themselves. The animals lowered their heads. And the ground around Nkaruka cracked. Hairline fractures in the soil, glowing faintly red like embers beneath skin. Adan didn't speak to her stepmother. She didn't have to. The ground did. From its trembling mouth came the echo of every lie, every cruelty, every moment Nkaruka had twisted the world to her will and laughed. You called her beast. You named her dirt. You fed your hate and starved her name. You forgot. The earth remembers. Nkaruka sobbed. She crawled to Adan's feet and grasped her ankle. I was afraid, she whispered. You were too wild. Too different. I didn't understand. Adan looked down. Not with pity. Not even rage. But recognition. She had seen this fear before, in animals cornered, in goats sensing a storm. It was not remorse. It was survival. Still crouching, Adan leaned down, close to Nkaruka's ear. And for the first time she spoke in her own voice, low, steady, fierce. I am not what you made me. She stood. The beasts vanished, one by one, into mist. The cracks in the earth sealed like a wound healed too fast. Nkaruka lay on the ground, shaking, eyes wide, unable to rise. Adan turned and walked into the forest, the stone beast still at her hip, the night alive with silence. And the village? The village never dared call her beast again. Here is the 1800-word expansion for The Beast That Spoke, continuing the rich, mythic tone of Adan's reckoning. The forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. No birds. No insects. Not even the wind dared speak. The trees, ancient and twisted, seemed to lean closer to one another, as though whispering secrets too old and dangerous to be heard aloud. The soil was damp underfoot, the air thick with the scent of moss and memory. Adan stood at the edge of the village, just where the path turned from packed earth to shadowed undergrowth. Her feet were bare, her hair unbound, and her eyes, once dull and downcast, now shone with a light that was not light. A weightless golden fire shimmered faintly beneath her skin. The stone with the carved beast's face lay tucked at her hip, humming softly like a heartbeat. Behind her, the village stirred uneasily. No one had seen her since the night of the moon festival, when she had walked through fire with flame-born wings and a shadow that didn't belong to any human child. Since that night, whispers had taken root like weeds. Crops failed. Chickens lay dead in the coop. Children spoke of dreams where they ran through woods not as themselves, but as something furred and sharp. They said the girl had become the thing the goats always knew she was. A beast. A storm in rags. A curse with eyes. Nkaruka had tried to act unbothered, but sleep had fled her. Her hands trembled. Her bones ached. She poured salt on every doorstep and hung dry leaves over the bed, but still, the dreams came. The scratching on the walls returned. And then tonight, the night of the blood moon, she heard Adan's voice. For the first time. It was not the voice of a girl. It was the voice of the forest. It rose up from the ground, curled through the trees, and slid through every crack in every hut, filling ears and bowls and mouths, choking out sleep and silence. It was not a scream. It was a declaration. I name what was done. Her voice echoed not just through air, but through root and stone, through every animal that had ever watched her suffer, through every breath ever held in the throat of a girl afraid to speak. I named the first night I was left cold. A wind howled through the village. Doors burst open. Firewood cracked. I named the slap that broke my tooth. Ash rained from a hearth that hadn't been lit in hours. I named the nights I was starved while others feasted. Goats rose to their feet without command, stepping into the courtyard like soldiers. I name every insult that tried to become my name. The earth trembled beneath her. Villagers poured into the open, shouting, confused, clinging to charms. Then came a scream. Nkaruka, eyes wild, bolted from her hut, bare feet slapping the ground, trying to flee down the slope toward the yam fields. But the path twisted. The trees bent. The world around her shifted. She stumbled into the wrong clearing, one that hadn't been there before, and fell. Flat. Face first into the dirt. When she looked up, she gasped. She was surrounded. Not by people. By beasts. Their eyes glowed in the dark. Wolves, jackals, wild dogs, goats with horns too long, boars with bleeding tusks. They stood still, utterly silent, not moving to attack, not blinking. Watching her. And then she saw them clearly. Not beasts. Memories. The goat she'd starved because it was too slow. The dog she'd beaten with a stick until its leg broke. The hen she'd cursed for pecking her hand. All of them. Not dead. Not alive. Just present. Like the truth finally made flesh. She tried to scream, but the air in her throat turned solid. Her voice betrayed her. Adan stepped into the circle of beasts. She didn't walk, she moved like a whisper across bark, like smoke with feet. Her eyes held Nkaruka in place. And then, calmly, she crouched and touched the ground with her fingertips. The earth moaned. It wasn't loud, but it was deep. A sound that came from far beneath the roots, from the belly of the world. The trees creaked as if bracing themselves. The animals lowered their heads. And the ground around Nkaruka cracked. Hairline fractures in the soil, glowing faintly red like embers beneath skin. Adan didn't speak to her stepmother. She didn't have to. The ground did. From its trembling mouth came the echo of every lie, every cruelty, every moment Nkaruka had twisted the world to her will and laughed. You called her beast. You named her dirt. You fed your hate and starved her name. You forgot. The earth remembers. Nkaruka sobbed. She crawled to Adan's feet and grasped her ankle. I was afraid, she whispered. You were too wild. Too different. I didn't understand. Adan looked down. Not with pity. Not even rage. But recognition. She had seen this fear before, in animals cornered, in goats sensing a storm. It was not remorse. It was survival. Still crouching, Adan leaned down, close to Nkaruka's ear. And for the first time she spoke in her own voice, low, steady, fierce. I am not what you made me. She stood. The beasts vanished, one by one, into mist. The cracks in the earth sealed like a wound healed too fast. Nkaruka lay on the ground, shaking, eyes wide, unable to rise. Adan turned and walked into the forest, the stone beast still at her hip, the night alive with silence. And the village? The village never dared call her beast again. She left before dawn. No farewell. No cry. No footstep sound. Only the hush of morning dew and the breath of goats bowing their heads as she passed. Adan walked through the village one final time, barefoot on the cool earth, draped not in rags but in something new, a robe stitched from dark cloth and hide, from the shadows of her old pain and the fur of those who had walked beside her in silence. It moved like smoke when she stepped. Like memory. Like the wind. No one dared stop her. From behind closed shutters, villagers peeked out. They saw her and bowed their heads, not in shame, not entirely, but in reverence. Children held their dolls close, as if trying to remember the shape of her face before she disappeared into the trees. The barn stood empty. The goats bleated softly, pressed together as if waiting for something they could not name. Her mat remained untouched. The small stone with the beast's carved face had vanished. Some said it had returned to the earth. Some said she still carried it beneath her skin. By midday, the house where Nkaruka once ruled sat hollow. Vines crept up its walls. Dust coated its mats. No one lived there now. Even the air avoided it. It was said Adan crossed the river barefoot, her shadow slipping over the water like a second self. That when she passed the sacred tree on the hill, its leaves turned upward, like palms in prayer. That her laugh, low and rare, stirred the sleeping birds and made them follow her flight. But no one saw her again. Not truly. And yet the stories began. In a distant village, a thief tried to steal a widow's last yam, but his hand froze in midair, clawed by something unseen. Behind him, they said, came a growl low and close. And then a whisper, feed her first. In the woods beyond the western ridge, hunters chasing a wounded deer vanished for 3 days. When they returned, they said a girl with fire in her eyes and goats at her side had blocked their path, saying, take only what you can bless. Children whispered about the beast girl, the one who had worn shame like a second skin, then shed it like fur at dusk. The one who once danced in rags but now walked with the storm. They said she could become the wind between trees, growling, gentle, always watching. They said she visited only those who had been called lesser, the outcast, the quiet, the ones locked behind gates of fear and tradition. And when she came, she did not roar. She listened. She laid a hand on the earth. And the earth answered. Years passed. And sometimes, on stormy nights, when the wind howled and the trees leaned close to whisper, a child would sit upright and smile, not afraid. Because they knew. The girl who wore the wind was near. And she never forgot.